issue and weren't able to put them in the packet, so we'll present those minutes at the next meeting.
Okay, fair enough. Anyone wish to speak on any non-agenda items tonight in a public forum? Non-agenda, perfect, okay. All right, cool, we'll move right into new business. We're gonna have a staff presentation and we'll have a public hearing tonight on some proposed changes to the land use agenda, or I'm sorry, the land use code. We'll let staff go first, or do you want to just open public hearing procedure?
I'll take it here if you don't mind. I've got a few words to share and then I'll go over our public hearing procedures.
Staff presentation first.
Not quite the presentation, just a general overview. So for those that are present and tuning in online, just wanted to kind of recap. Commissioner or Chairman Sarter introduced this item as a public hearing to consider land use code amendments to address housing affordability in Wellington. Just a quick recap, we've been working with a consultant, Matrix Design, Inc., and they have done a lot of data collection to help prepare the draft housing needs assessment and housing needs and affordability assessment that's in the Planning Commission packet tonight. It's also been made available on the town's website for a number of months, as well as some supporting information there. But that effort began in August with data collection, research, preparing housing trends, and putting together the components of that draft housing needs assessment that's in the packet. We also conducted an online resident survey that was open for a number of months to collect citizen feedback. We've got a couple boards that we've used in those exercises here in front of the commission, kind of identifying resident needs and desires for other types of housing within the community. And we've done pretty extensive stakeholder engagement with key players in the housing market for Wellington. So what we've found through these efforts, housing affordability is a really big topic. It's not one that's one and done. It's not addressed overnight. It's a long haul approach, a series of considerations to be taken into account, and likely will take many years to achieve the desired intent. Through this housing needs assessment, we've identified that there are income gaps in the marketplace. There's housing shortages. There's dwelling type shortages, and there's recommendations in this housing needs assessment for identifying strategies for how to start to close the gaps on housing affordability in Wellington. We're going to get into that in a little bit more detail here in just a moment. But I did want to acknowledge that the strategies and recommendations that were in the draft report that the Planning Commission considered at the last meeting, we had feedback from the commissioners to take a look at those short-term, medium-term, and long-term strategies and put them into more of a format that was consistent with other types of implementation tables we have in our other planning documents to kind of identify priority, time, resources, or costs associated with those. And so we did go through that effort. Matrix looked at that with us as well. And so we've included a draft implementation table per Planning Commission's request to kind of outline those different stages of implementation. And suffice it to say, what we've kind of found is that right now, the short-term goals or strategies are the ones that we've kind of taken a closer look at as being those that are more regulatory barriers. And if we're able to remove some of those barriers in our regulations, then allowing the free market to do what the free market does best, which is find creative solutions to bring those products to bear. So we did move those into the short-term category, and those are the topics that we're kind of addressing tonight through proposed code amendments and considerations. So I wanted to acknowledge that draft implementation table. It's in your packet. And that kind of sets the stage for this next step and where we're at right now with the code amendments, which leads me into our public hearing procedures. I know many of you are tired of hearing this from me, but I'll go over it just in case so that we all know where we're at in terms of our meeting procedure. In just a moment, I'm going to ask for conflicts of interest and ex parte communications from the Planning Commission. As a reminder, ex parte communications are just correspondence or communications that happen outside of a meeting, and disclosing what those communications were in the substance allows everyone at the table to have the same information when forming opinions or recommendations. So we'll ask for that in just a moment. Then we'll do a staff introduction. Our planning staff will be presenting the slide presentation that was in your packet and going over some of those materials. After the planning staff introduction, if there's any clarifying questions or remarks from the commissioners, we'd gladly take those. Then we'll open the public hearing. Public will be allowed 3 minutes to speak during the public comment period. And following the close of all public comments, planning staff may respond to some of the information that was heard to either clarify or provide a response to questions. And then we'll turn it over to the Planning Commission, and that's the opportunity for you to deliberate on the subject matter for the public hearing. Are there any questions regarding the public hearing procedures? I did put a copy in front of you in case you want to make those notes as you go along. Very good. If there are no questions, then I would circle back to if there are any conflicts of interest that commissioners would like to disclose or ex parte communications.
I did receive an email from Christine Gator recapping the comments from the downtown core from the 2021 comprehensive plan, which I did email you guys to let you know that I received it. I don't know if everyone else received it, but I did want to be clear that it was just going back to what the sentiment was during that process, and along with a copy of the petition that they had originally submitted to the town.
Thank you.
I did as well. I don't know if it was the same communication, but I did as well.
I have no conflicts of interest, but I will acknowledge that I did receive a copy of that Ms. Gator's email.
Okay.
Same.
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. Very, very good. Understood. Okay. Any other disclosures? Okay. Then, Mr. Chairman, if it's all right, we'll move into staff presentation.
Proceed.
Thank you very much. While Ms. Lenore is coming up here, I'm going to open up the presentation.
Good evening, Commissioners. I'm Brittany Lenore with our Town of Wellington Planning Department. I'm here along with Cody Bird and Aiden Checkett, and we'll be presenting the draft code amendments for you tonight in regards to the housing needs and affordability assessment. So just for some context, the Planning Commission has reviewed the first and second draft of this housing needs assessment, the first draft being at the work session back in December, and the second draft, the one that is in your packet as well, this past Planning Commission meeting on February 3rd. And so in that meeting, there were a number of housing strategies identified, and you directed staff to look at all of those housing strategies. And that is similar sentiment that we received when we reviewed this with our Board of Trustees. They supported the draft housing strategy amendments or strategies. And so staff is proposing a few code amendments to address those strategies. So Wellington's housing and needs and affordability cannot be met using just one single strategy. And you can see that through the housing needs assessment and affordability. There are multiple strategies identified that address various components of need and affordability. And as Cody mentioned earlier, our staff during this step one kind of looked at the regulatory framework that we have in our land use code and ways that we can amend that to speak on some of these items, such as expanding accessory dwelling unit creation, what the regulations look around that, and some of our dimensional standards, and looking at ways we can diversify housing stock. And so the code amendments that are being presented tonight are considered step one of this overall endeavor. And this step is those items that are shorter term, lower cost, and in-house staffing. And these amendments look like things to amend our ADU regulations, look at infill development, diversification of housing stock, and removing those barriers and expanding opportunities for housing. So staff broke down this step 1 into 4 separate goals. And tonight we'll be reviewing those 4 goals with you. And Aiden Checkett will be here to talk about goals 1 and 2.
As Mr. Checkett's coming up here, our staff did talk about how to present this, and we would encourage you, if there's a question about a slide or the subject matter being presented, go ahead and stop us and ask that question while it's salient. We don't need you to hold it until the end. So, thank you.
Thanks, Cody. Thanks, Brittany. Good evening, commissioners. I'm here to discuss with you the first 2 goals as part of this iterative process. Like Cody and Brittany mentioned, these changes we're proposing today are just the first step in this process, but these are changes that are immediately actionable. These aren't incentives. These are basically the town looking at our own regulations and figuring out what are the things we're doing that are limiting affordability. How can we step out of the way, and how can we ensure that the playing field is level and that people have access to affordable housing as much as we can. The recommendations stem from a number of sources, including obviously that housing needs assessment that this body has seen a couple of times now, stakeholder interviews with people throughout Wellington and Larimer County, neighboring communities and their policies, and then last but not least, staff's understanding of the community. We tried really hard to make sure these recommendations are Wellington sized and Wellington appropriate. Obviously, we took inspiration, but we know that Wellington is not Fort Collins, it's not Loveland, so these are policies specifically tailored for Wellington and that can hopefully bridge the gap between preserving the things that makes this community what it is and makes it so appealing to people who live here with the necessary changes and steps that are going to be made in order to make sure that it continues to be accessible, affordable for people who want to live here. So in that vein, the first goal we identified is to increase the diversity of housing types. As the data shows, as well as the eye test shows, Wellington is mostly comprised of single-family detached homes right now. Single-family detached homes are obviously a great product, right? They come with a lot of advantages. They're private, they're spacious. There's a reason that, the majority of Americans either live or would like to live in a single-family home. However, they also have drawbacks. The number one drawback is they are the most expensive form of housing. And the data increasingly shows that the majority of Wellington residents can't afford to live in the average home in Wellington, let alone the average single-family home. So solution obviously isn't right. We're not talking about trying to take away existing single-family homes or reduce the number of single-family homes, but we're talking about ensuring there's a diversity of stock so that people ranging the gamut can afford to live here. Yeah, Commissioner Carmen.
Yeah, so my question is the comments that you just made about Wellington residents' views on affordability based on the study that Matrix did?
Mm-hmm.
So 104 participants are the basis for basically everything we're talking about tonight.
So that's partially the basis, yes, but we're also pulling from a lot of data, including, right, we have AMI both for Wellington, but also for the region. That's average median income. So that's how much the average household is making an income. And that's not coming from that survey, right? That's data from, I believe, the American Community Survey, which is something put out by the US Census Bureau, I believe, and that's considered one of the most authoritative sources in demography. It's also based on matrix data analyses of the housing market as it currently exists, based on Zillow and Redfin data. So yeah, I mean, that survey obviously is a component of this, but we are pulling from multiple databases, including some of the most reputable sources available.
So in that study on page 94, 23% cite affordability as an issue. So 23 people.
No, I'll jump in here quickly. So Commissioner Carmen, might have been at the meeting that you weren't here for when Matrix presented some of the more details on the.
I was here in December and voiced similar comments in December in the work session.
Right, and you missed the subsequent meeting when Matrix was here presenting additional information on the recommendations. So what was shared at that last meeting was in Matrix putting together the H&A, or the housing needs assessment. The data that they pulled that Mr. Checkett alluded to comes from the American Community Survey, which is an estimate of the demographics, housing projections for the community. The data is based on the American Community Survey information that's available to us.
Yeah, they shared that in December.
Okay, good.
Mhm.
So in the resident survey that didn't close until mid-December, because we allowed it to stay open for more comments, the resident input confirmed what was discovered in the data that was analyzed from the ACS. It's very closely aligned on the points that the data was already unveiling. So the recommendations are not based solely on the resident data from the resident survey of 104 respondents. It's
Right.
based on the analytical data that Matrix put together. It was confirmed by what we were hearing from residents directly.
Well, I just want to go on record that 104 people is not a very big sample for the town of Wellington, right?
And if I could get more people to respond, I absolutely would. This was a widely advertised online public survey. We sent it out via social media. It's been on our website, or was on our website for, September through December, nearly 3 months. And we had bilingual advertisements out via social media and in person, and postcards that were given out at several public events. We took a lot of effort to reach a broad audience. We can't make people respond.
Thank you.
Yes, so the data shows that the average Wellington household could not afford to buy a home in today's market. I believe you should have a handout with you commissioners showing the average salaries for a worker in the healthcare industry, the educational industry, and the construction industry. And I believe, if I'm remembering, if you added those three salaries up together, you would have the income required to purchase the average home in Wellington. Obviously, there's not a lot of, 3-income adult households. So that is kind of proof of concept of the gap here. And that's where housing diversity comes in, right? Those townhome products, those apartment complexes or apartment products or multifamily, be they duplexes, triplexes, those are more affordable. So the steps taken then, or the steps that staff has discussed and is bringing before you to move forward towards at least allowing the possibility of a diversity of housing stocks are as followed. The first is to update the district intent statements for the R2, R3, R4, and PUD districts. The district intent statements are in our land use code, and they're essentially just a short paragraph outlining the intent of that district and the direction of development moving forward. So the changes for R2 and R3 are chiefly to outline accessory dwelling units, ADUs, as an acceptable use. ADUs are already an allowed use in those districts. As staff will discuss further tonight, we have some proposals for ways to make ADUs more affordable and accessible. But this language would emphasize further that ADUs, they're already allowed, but that they're an important component of the affordability conversation. Yeah.
As you're considering the ADU piece of it, and yes, they are a permitted use, are we considering, in addition to that, some type of a policy change internally that is going to encourage new homeowners associations to not prohibit them? Because the majority of our housing in Wellington outside of the downtown core area is HOA.
So we're not doing that in this current effort, but we've identified other steps, and we can definitely have that conversation with community property managers for how to work through the various HOA covenants if they choose to pursue that option.
The changes to the R4 district intent statement would include staff's recommendation to allow limited multifamily homes within the R4 district. I'm going to discuss more about what this might look like, but just to kind of key things off, we're not talking about big apartment complexes. We're not talking about the 5-on-1s that you might see down in Fort Collins or Loveland. We're talking about, modest duplexes, fourplexes, up to maybe 8plexes that would have similar architectural restrictions and guidelines as the rest of Old Town. Secondly, we would recommend allowing manufactured homes as a use by right in the R3 medium density district. Manufactured homes are an allowed use by right in every other residential district right now, and there's actually state statutes stating that they must be allowed in any district where single-family detached homes are allowed. So actually, according to state statutes, that's something that is probably a requirement. Allowing multifamily dwellings in the R4 downtown district, like I was alluding to earlier, that is currently not an allowed use, and we're proposing that becoming an allowed use. Almost all of Wellington's neighboring municipalities allow some form of multifamily development in the R4 district. However, staff recognizes that the R4 district has a unique character that is important to the town as a whole. It's part of the town's identity. So that's why we're also proposing a limit of a maximum of 8 dwelling units per building in those multifamily units. It's also important to note that under the current definition, a multifamily unit includes things like an upstairs, downstairs duplex. It includes things like a side-by-side duplex on one lot or a triplex all on one lot. Under the current zoning code, you can't have any of those things within the R4 district. We actually do have a few non-conforming properties. So part of what this would be doing would be enabling those properties to do that. There's lots of precedent for this within neighboring municipalities, and we don't anticipate this having a significant change in the gross density of R4 and, in the total number of buildings or in the architectural character. This would allow homeowners to convert their house into an upstairs, downstairs duplex, or if they have an extra big lot, right, they might want to expand their house to make it slightly bigger, or, there are going to be a few instances of large lots, in which case you might be looking at putting in a small 4, 6, or 8plex. We believe that the R4 is a district that is obviously vital to the character of this town. It's also designed to have a wider variety of housing types naturally than, maybe the R2 or some of the newer developments. And this is a piece of that. Yeah.
There's a height restriction in R4, correct?
Yes, there is, and we would not be changing that.
Okay, thank you.
I believe the height restriction is 24, 28 feet right now. Any other questions on that? We're also going to have a section for questions at the end of the presentation, so we're happy to discuss then. Okay, so these are just a few examples, kind of visuals of what we might be looking at. I think this helps, especially with the multifamily. So in the top left, that's an example of what an ADU might look like. Brittany's going to come back and talk more about the changes we're proposing to ADUs. But that's an example right there of an ADU that I think personally would be a good aesthetic fit in most of our neighborhoods. On the top right there, we have an example of an 8plex, which would be the largest allowed or the most units allowed in a structure for a multifamily under the R4 changes that we're proposing. In the bottom left, those are some pretty representative examples of townhomes, which are usually considered single family attached. But if they were all on one lot, that would also be considered multifamily under our code. And then in the bottom right, I believe that's an upstairs, downstairs duplex. So that's another example of, again, kind of modest, gentle density R4 multifamily zoning, or, in other lots too. So then the second goal is to increase the diversity, not just of dwelling types, but of dwelling sizes and configurations. So we're looking at some changes to our zoning districts in terms of densities, widths, and lot areas. So the numbers they vary, right? We're looking at relatively modest increases to the R2 and R4 densities. R2 would go from 6 dwelling units per acre to 8, and R4 would go from 12 to 16. It's important to note that both of these districts, their current gross densities, so gross density is the actual density of the district or neighborhood as a whole, both of them are well under the current minimum allowed density. So any change wouldn't be, dramatically altering the character of the neighborhood. It's more likely to affect things on a net density level, which is essentially like one lot, right? So there are actually a number of developments in these districts that technically are above our zoning. And that can be as simple as there's an upstairs, downstairs duplex in Old Town, which technically goes over the current density limit and thus wouldn't be permitted if we didn't include that or increase that. From the outside, it's a completely normal looking single family house. It just has an upstairs, downstairs divide. R3 and C3, we're looking at higher increases. Both of those would go from 12 to 24 DUs per acre. That's very representative with the medium and mixed use residential districts in other municipalities. We have some housing projects, apartments, even townhome projects in R3 that also would not currently meet the maximum. So this would essentially enable projects, a lot of which would look like ones we already have, or maybe slightly denser ones. We're not looking at, dramatic shifts in the actual built environment. This is just about essentially enabling a slight increase in what we already have, allowing existing projects, and making subtle but impactful changes down the road. Commensurate with that, density, lot widths, and lot area are all connected, right? The maximum or the minimum lot area needs to be a certain size in order to achieve a certain number of dwelling units per acre. All of that is just kind of mathematically related. All those exact numbers can be found within the red lines in the packet. I'm not going to go through, the specificities of, so many square feet, but we can certainly get into that during questions. Finally, and this is an impactful change, I think, is to remove the minimum floor area above grade per dwelling regulation. Basically, our code right now says that there is a minimum size of house that you can build. Basically, you can't build a house or a property of less than 864 square feet. Part of why we want to make this change is to protect the R4 district. There are a number of homes in R4 that are under that 864 square foot limit. And if those homes were, destroyed in an accident, unfortunately, under the current code, homeowners wouldn't be able to rebuild their own home or put in an equivalent use. So this would essentially.
No, I just wanted to comment on that also. In fact, they could rebuild the use, but they'd have to rebuild it larger than it was existing before, which doesn't speak to affordability.
Yeah, thanks for the clarification, Cody. So this would essentially protect a number of the smaller, relatively affordable houses that we already have, as well as ensure that, if a private homeowner wants to build a small house on their property, right, who are we to prevent them as long as it meets the building code and the 1974 Colorado statutes on mobile homes or manufactured homes? Do you have a question, Commissioner Street?
Yeah, follow-up question. So are you saying this is the only way to resolve that? Are there other options that we need to consider to resolve that?
The square footage.
No, the example of a home in R4 that is destroyed for whatever reason, that they have to build it bigger. And so the only way to resolve that is to change the code. Or are there other ways to resolve that?
So presently, the way the codes work, if a structure is removed for any reason, then that structure is gone, and you're building a new structure, it has to conform with all of the requirements of the code. So what Mr. Checkett is representing here, if there's a 600 square foot existing home.
Yeah, I understand that, but that's not my question. That question's been answered. My question is that the only way to resolve that particular issue? Or within the code, is there a way to grandfather, for example, certain structures that may be that size, that maybe have been built in a particular year, that they can be rebuilt as is?
There's an entire Article 7 on non-conforming uses and non-conforming structures that outlines what you're speaking to. It's not particularly easy to navigate, and for a homeowner who's looking to rebuild, coming and asking a simple question, I want to build it back the way it was, or I've removed a 600 square foot house and I want to build a 600 square foot house, their only option is to comply with the current requirements. And what we've kind of identified is that 864 square feet, while it's not huge, we have quite a few homes that are less than that currently that people live in and enjoy. So why are we creating a standard that says it has to be 864 square feet when building codes allow much smaller units to be constructed? So there are more complicated ways to get at protecting that and allowing that, but why put someone through it when we can just remove a standard that says it has to be this big?
Thank you.
And I didn't mean to, the question wasn't intended to put you on the spot. It was more of a general, you know, there are other ways we can do it. It would require more regulation to write codes for those
Yeah,
unique
and I'm not,
circumstances.
yeah, and I'm not interested in that at all. I'm just wanting to make sure we're, exploring all the options, right?
Yeah, of
Yeah.
course. And I took it that way. Thank you.
I just offer, as this process was going on 4 years ago now, which is crazy, there was a lot of conversation around the non-conforming buildings within the R4 district. And there are some specific languages to protect certain buildings within R4 to make sure that in the event that something happened, they would still be able to rebuild. But to that end, you would have to literally identify specific properties. I mean, there are other code changes that are also making things conforming, meaning these people would be able to retain what they already have, which is definitely the message that I have heard time and time and time again from the town of Wellington. So
Yeah, thank you.
just offering that to
Appreciate
you.
it.
There was a really long discussion about this before.
Yeah. And even from a simpler point of view too, if it's a vacant lot, there's currently nothing on it and it's a 4,000 square foot.
That's easy.
Right, but they have, currently under the code, they have to build at 864 square feet. If they said, I would really like to build a 600 square foot house, our answer would be no. And they could say, that's how we can afford to build it. And our answer is no. And that doesn't feel,
But that's always going to be the case. I mean, you get someone that wants to build a 500, right? So that wasn't my concern as much as the point of somebody's, primary resident gets destroyed and they have to build it bigger, right? And that's the only way, right? And what are the unintended consequences of shifting it to 600, right? Because there could be some other consequences to creating a smaller threshold, right?
well, there are ample requirements in the building code and other codes that address livability, life safety, hazards and things like that.
Density.
Density is only in the zoning.
Mm-hmm.
But we're looking at in this particular, the conversation that was going on just now around the minimum square footages for dwelling units, building codes, life safety codes, egress, other requirements address what is safe. And if it meets the safety requirements and someone wants to construct it, is there a governmental reason, a facetious question, but is there a governmental reason saying, no, you can't build it that size, even though you meet all of our other requirements? That our zoning is artificially requiring things to be bigger than what other people may choose to do. And that's why we've identified it as a potential to, removing that requirement could allow more flexibility and more have affordable housing options, is why it's in this context.
Thank you.
Is it unheard of to not have a minimum above ground area in a building code or in a land use code? Are we breaking new ground here, or have you seen it in other municipalities?
It's not breaking new ground. What I could speak to is that historically, and you look back at decades of land use controls in the United States, the very first zoning regulations were steered very directly at creating strict segregation of uses. We don't want this next to that. And to cause things to be more spread out, which has resulted in decades later, housing that's become unaffordable. And what you're seeing now in regulatory reform is intermixing of appropriate and compatible uses instead of strict segregation. And the standards of large lot size, 15,000 square feet, that hasn't been the standard here, but in other communities I've worked in, 15,000 square feet was the minimum lot size requirement. And you can't build affordable housing on a 15,000 square foot lot. The land and infrastructure costs cause those to go up and up and up. Builders tend to build, no offense to any builders in the room, but builders tend to sell square footage of a unit. And if they are restricted to the number of units, they make them bigger to sell that square footage to meet the minimum requirements. So the cumulative effect that we've seen in planning over decades worth of time is the standards that were in place at one point to create health and safety benefits have been supplanted by changes to the building code that make structures safer, changes to materials, changes to fire mitigation that allows those units to be constructed closer together. We haven't had a Chicago fire in a while. Wildfires are a different issue perhaps, and there's more codes on those to be adopted. But what we're seeing is that those changes that have been in place for decades are starting to go the other way. And so removing something like a minimum square foot for a structure, there are other controls in the code that address how many units you can have within a certain area. So back to Commissioner Carmen's comment, there are other controls in our codes that would limit the risk of fire spread, that would limit the other hazards associated with removing that square foot for minimum lot size or minimum structure size.
Right.
Ask you one more question.
Of course.
By doing this, does this increase the opportunity for someone to then build a smaller primary living unit and perhaps then also end up being able to add an ADU that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do because they wouldn't have enough
Yes.
space on their lot then, right? For setbacks, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So
Yep,
it
it would.
increases the opportunities
what
in
it
a couple.
does.
Yeah, that's great. Okay.
Well, and just a quick search, 400 square feet is what typically gets associated with tiny houses.
Correct.
Yep.
Yeah.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So in summation, these changes are, or these suggested changes are intended to not to cause any large scale change in what's already existing, but to make, small changes where appropriate and to enable the residents, owners to have freedom to explore options and to create affordable housing for people in a variety of circumstances, a variety of economic levels, and essentially to ensure that we're not getting in anyone's way as long as what they're proposing is safe within the building code. It's not out of sync and out of character with the neighborhood as it is, and it doesn't pose many other major infrastructure challenges. Those are the kind of barriers in the zoning code and in the land use code that we're suggesting eliminating. Are there any other questions on goals 1 and goals 2 from the commissioners? Okay, with that, I'm going to hand it back to Brittany then, and she's going to discuss goals 3 and goals 4. Thank you.
So for our goal 3, it's primarily focusing on ADUs, accessory dwelling units. These are often used as a housing type that is a smaller unit, accessory to your primary. And by nature, since it's a smaller unit, it is oftentimes more affordable than your larger primary unit. And so changes include revising the allowed size of ADUs. So currently it is 1,000 square feet. We're proposing 1,200 square feet maximum, or 100% of the primary, whichever is less. So if you have an 800 square foot home, you can build an 800 square foot ADU. If you have a 1,300 square foot home, you can build a 1,200 square foot ADU. In addition to the size, we're looking at simplifying those design requirements for ADUs. And so the requirement would be that it has to match in terms of compatibility to the existing house. That could mean building form, building materials, building colors. It doesn't have to be all of them, but it has to speak to the existing in some way. In addition, we're looking at increasing the number of ADUs on larger lots. So if your lot is a half acre or more, you could potentially have 2 ADUs on your property. One being a detached and another being either an attached to your home or an interior conversion, but not 2 detached. It has to be one or the other.
And is this still for R2 through 4?
This
Or are
is,
we including R1 in this
this is for all residential zoning districts.
for all? Okay. And then I'm just curious, what's the sense of how many properties could actually put an ADU on their property? For example, where I live, there's no way it would make any sense to put an ADU on my property. So do we have a sense of even what that might do?
So, did you want to answer the question or you want me to start it?
I can start it and you can jump in.
Okay, very good.
So I think it depends on what type of ADU we're talking about. There are conversions of interior existing space, basement units that people can convert to ADUs. So it really depends on what we're talking about. For those detached, I think there are some lots that are more eligible for a detached unit for sure, just based off accessibility. But I think it could be a fair amount of properties within Wellington. And also, as of right now, we don't have much demand for ADUs. So we're just trying to explore a lot of our options to try and increase that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I think that was well answered. And the only thing I was going to add is most of our thinking tends to go immediately to a detached ADU, and there are other types, which Brittany answered really well.
So some other changes for our ADUs, just clarification in the code that ADUs can abide with our accessory structure setbacks. So those are reduced setbacks from our primary house setbacks. So that's just a consistency clarification point. And also updating our owner occupancy requirements. So as of right now, the code says that you have to either live within your ADU or you have to live within your primary home if you have an ADU on the site. And so we're looking at removing that entirely.
So for ADUs that are not detached, are there also changes in the code around separate access?
That would be addressed with our building code
Mhm.
and, but we don't have anything right now proposed in terms of that in the land use code.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Next slide.
Can you tell me what the change in the setbacks is for accessory dwelling? Like for
Yes.
detached?
Yes, let me look it up. 1 second.
And if you could tell us what page of the packet, that would be helpful as well.
Yeah.
Page 28 of 130. So I'm looking at the clean version. I guess we could look at the red line version. I'd have to get that page number.
It's page 14, Brittany,
Okay, thank you.
I believe.
So yeah, on page 14, you'll see the addition of detached accessory dwelling units in that header under accessory buildings. So currently, the minimum front, depending, it ranges from 25 to, 25 to 60. And then side is 5 feet to 20, and rear is 5 feet. So yeah, again, page 14.
And I think to expand on that answer a little bit, Brittany, did you want to speak to the other types of ADUs and why there was importance to distinguish between detached?
Yeah.
Or I can answer it too if you want me to.
No, I can answer. So yeah, as Cody mentioned, this is specifically for detached ADUs because we're looking at those as a standalone product. If you were choosing an attached unit like you see on that center graphic off to the right, you would have to meet the principal primary building setbacks in order to kind of maintain consistency visually and maintain that setback that your neighbor is used to for your attached principal structure. So these reduced setbacks are solely for detached ADU.
So do you have in here then the example of a basement set up as an ADU?
Not explicitly beyond just saying that you can have an interior ADU.
Right, and at least as it pertains to the setbacks, we didn't propose any changes to the setbacks. It was really more of a clarification that the setbacks in the code apply to a detached structure. We didn't want that to be interpreted as an ADU that's like a room addition or a garage conversion to have to meet the same setbacks as the accessory structures. Part of that's also addressed in the accessory language later in the code, where we tried to create clarity and distinction that just because it says accessory dwelling unit, it's not applicable to every principal setback. It is if it's attached, but if it's detached, this is the section we wanted to refer to.
So it's always been 5 feet for
Mm.
ADUs,
N-
the
so
setback?
The setback for accessory structures has been 5 feet for the rear yard, 5 feet for the side yards in R4, 7 feet for the side yards in R2, R1, R3.
So that's been the standard we've had.
Correct. 5 feet has been the smallest setback standard for any accessory structure.
So in theory, you could have 2 neighbors build ADUs that then are in essence only 10 feet apart from each other.
Theoretically, yes.
Or 4 if you're on corners.
Well,
Could be.
I'm just always
Potential.
thinking in terms of like fire safety,
Mhm.
right? So, but our building code
Would address that.
Right.
would,
and-
we would abide, those standards are not being relaxed, correct? Like in terms of the cement board and things like that.
Correct. And the building code, you can actually get closer than that if you do different
Let's not
fire
do
ratings and
that.
openings. The building code is separate from what we're considering tonight. But from a zoning standpoint, the 5-foot separation from a lot line creates a minimum 10-foot between structures, which is the typical 10-foot separation for fire safety between structures.
Okay, just making sure. Thank you.
And just to clarify that, land use code will never allow something that building code would not allow, right?
Say that again?
Yeah.
In theory.
All right, am I correct in that?
So I think what Mr. Checkett's getting at is that we have different codes that regulate different components. They all act independently in the sense that they have the authority to, govern their subject matter. Zoning, building, fire all work very closely together, and the intent is to not create conflicting provisions, but where there are conflicting provisions, the more stringent it typically requires is what governs. So you have to satisfy the most stringent requirement, then the other requirements come into play after that.
I just want to be sure that we're not, and I'm pro density to a degree, right? But that we're not sacrificing safety for density, given what we've seen happen, right? Here in the state with buildings built too close together. I mean, Fort Collins is ridiculous. Living in a very windy and dry area. I just don't want us to buy trouble we don't need to buy. That's why I was clarifying on the setbacks.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
no special provision or exception for accessory dwelling units in the building code.
Well, and a big unintended consequence of that is the social impact, right? Because now you got people irritated at each other because they can hear what's going on and see what's going on, right? So you got that issue that has to be considered. My question, though, I want to go back to other expectations around ADUs. So, if I had and I'm pro ADU, so don't misunderstand my question at all. But if I had an ADU for a family member, then accessing that ADU would not be an issue. Come through the front door of the house, right? But if I had an ADU that was set up for someone 2 or 3 steps removed, don't be coming in my house. You go to your living structure, right? And so beyond the actual ADU, what are the expectations? What do we anticipate the expectations around access, whether it's pedestrian access, parking associated with that ADU? It's not just the ADU, but it's also ingress and egress to it, right? Is that taken into consideration here in the codes?
So access and egress is a building code function, so they'd have to satisfy the building code for those proposals. Town of Wellington, your planning and zoning and building staff are all in the same department. So we literally have cubicles that share walls here to make sure those conversations happen. Fire has, emergency access and emergency responders has concerns that they may want to look into, like visibility of addresses from the street. Other communities have looked at having a paved path from the front of the lot to the ADU, if it's a detached ADU, for emergency services. So there are provisions in life safety, egress, and building codes that could apply to those. We don't define them explicitly in the zoning code because that makes a really broad assumption that we know what's going to be proposed. And we don't, because every lot's a little different.
Yep.
But we have other codes that would be in place to protect those concerns.
Great, thank you.
Yep, thanks.
One last question. So by removing the owner occupancy requirement, are we anticipating an opportunity for short-term rentals?
We could. Our code doesn't currently allow short-term rentals. It's not a defined use. That's a kind of a gray area
Right.
in terms of enforcement. But to establish a short-term rental program or requirements is a little bit more of a lift than we can take on right now, and it's not recommended in this set of code amendments. A short-term rental policy has to have quite a few definitions to lay things out. If it's going to have requirements and tracking, there has to be adequate staff resources and resources to administer those programs. Enforcement also becomes a kind of a sticky point for that. How do you monitor it? How do you enforce it if something's not following those rules? And if you charge a fee, collecting the right fee and how to administer those funds. There's a lot to that process that Wellington hasn't really seen the demand for short-term rentals presently. So we do identify this in that implementation table as a medium priority with a longer time frame to it based on the requirements for putting it all together.
Right, okay, good. Well, just as long as it's definitely on your radar that as we make this more accessible and easier to be done, we also need to definitely pinpoint that we want to make sure we get these policies in place. Just because I've seen other areas where it wasn't really a thing and then it became overwhelmingly a thing, right? And so I would hate to see a whole street suddenly become short-term rentals or something. I mean, we're not Estes Park, but it could happen. And so better to be proactive than reactive in this case.
And we definitely are aware of some of those
Okay.
challenges. This topic for short-term rentals has remained on the watch list. It hasn't risen to the demand that we need to address it immediately, but it is something we continue to look at and we'll program resources for as resources allow.
Okay, thank you.
That's an interesting data point.
Which
In the context of the larger conversation of affordability, it's interesting that we haven't seen a high demand for short-term rentals. So I'm just having a hard time reconciling, again, 104 respondents to the survey, no high demand for short-term rentals. And even on the survey, it was pretty 50-50 on what people were saying about what the need was. So it's just an interesting data point.
Yeah, and that's a good comment too. One of the challenges with short-term rentals is it doesn't typically fall under the housing affordability range. It actually works counter to it because if you're renting for a weekend, well, you're not a permanent, resident. You don't need affordability. You're paying for a weekend. And in the meantime, because it's not available to a resident or a renter in the community, it's above market rate, and that's not accessible to someone who might want it year round.
Yeah, and that's one type of short-term rental. You also have seasonal workers. You also have college students. There's a lot of other categories of short-term rental too.
Yeah, I guess, it can certainly depend on the construct of the definition for what is the term that is short. A lot of the state and regional research that we've looked at, 30 days is what's defined as short. I've seen others that go 3 months, and it really just depends on community needs and goals. And that, to be perfectly frank, that's a topic that we haven't delved into to look at where that break point might be for Wellington. There are other types of rental needs out there that are not permanent rental needs, but you know, that's something that we can definitely make notes on and bring back for later conversations too. I think it's an important conversation to have at some point, for sure.
Okay, so on to the next slide. Thank you, Cody. So on to goal number 4. So that will be
Next slide.
in the next slide.
Sorry, not yet.
So goal number 4, we're looking at reducing land requirements and costs for multifamily dwellings. As of right now, our current code has a unit restriction for per structure. So R1, 2, and 3 is limited to 1 dwelling unit per structure. So that could preclude that interior or attached ADU. So we're looking at changing that. In addition, our R4 zone, we would look at adding in a restriction that would limit a structure to have 8 dwelling units. So that'd be the max. The intention behind that, or the idea would be that it would be a less intense building, a shorter building. And if you had room in R4 to do a density higher than 8 units, then you would have to be in 2 separate structures. Again, to kind of control and protect that existing context. In addition to kind of shift into the land cost component, one of the amendments we're requesting is removing the functional open space requirement for multifamily. So as of right now, you're required to provide 20% of the site for functional open space. That's space for recreation and wildlife, open areas. And the idea behind removing this is that, you know, if we're looking at a lot of those infill sites that are already developed around, 20% of that site designated for open space can be really impactful and can make a project not pencil out or move forward. And again, the idea for infill is that there's already those amenities somewhere else. There's already a park around that people could use. And so we'd want to get rid of that entirely.
Remove it completely or reduce it?
For multifamily, remove it completely.
Thank you.
And I'll add to the conversation a little bit. In Chapter 15, Article 5, there's provisions under the open space and recreation design requirements that have a whole nother code section on how to define what is a functional open space versus what might just be a stormwater pond. It might be open space, but if it's not functional, it meets a different criteria. And within that, amongst other criteria for what's a pocket park, what's a regional park, what's a community park. And what we're proposing here is that there's a lot of opportunities for small, some of the examples we pointed to earlier in Mr. Checkett's slides, that stacked duplex scenario, that would qualify as, by definition, as a multifamily dwelling. And that might not make sense to require 20% functional open space. You're not going to build a park on a 4,000 square foot lot. And so we feel comfortable that there's another section of the code for a large scale multifamily project that's a greenfield type of development. There's provisions in place that require what that design and requirements and dedications looks like, along with provisions for the town board of trustees to negotiate dedications based on certain factors. So we feel comfortable that the other code section adequately covers this, and read strictly black and white, if you have a 20% requirement for multifamily dwellings in this section of the code, you would have to satisfy it for every multifamily dwelling, which may not make sense. Our proposal eliminates it from the black and white version and allows it to follow the design criteria in Chapter 15, Article 5.
Is there a certain size limit that then kicks in? Because I think open space is still an important factor just in general. I'm a big open space advocate, but I think when we're talking about multifamily, typically we are talking about people with lesser means, right? They're not able to purchase their own home. They may choose not to, right? But typically you have lower income folks that live in multifamily housing. And to remove a requirement that would provide them with some outdoor space to, I don't know, do somersaults with their 4-year-old, I want to make sure that there's, for infill, it makes perfect sense, right? Like if you're building 2 units, makes perfect sense. But is there a minimum unit set where that requirement then kicks in the design standards? Because I don't want to see there be a loophole where suddenly we have developers that want to build like brownstone multifamily housing that there's no greenery, it's concrete and that's it.
So in my opinion, that's where the Article 5 of Chapter 15 comes into play. If you're going through a site plan review for a multifamily development project, it would go through all of the Article 5 design criteria requirements, and those triggers would come into play for those projects. An infill development, even up to like the 8 units on a small constrained site where your net density is constrained, requiring 20% of that could eliminate, there's actually a really great graphic here that we'll get to in a moment, for both for the open space and for the parking. When you start adding up 20% open space and off-street parking, that limits the ability to build dwelling units on that same space. And so that's what we're trying to avoid, is the layered approach of you have to satisfy all of these requirements and still make it affordable. It's just not.
No, I
penciling out.
understand. I'm more thinking of like, I want to build, like, we had this conversation a few months ago of how many apartment buildings, right? Like legit apartment buildings are in this town. There's one, well, there's one complex, right? And that's it. And so I'm thinking more in that kind of context, right? Of your building, you want to come in and you want to build 20, 40 apartment units. I want to make sure that something kicks in that you have to have some open space with that, right? Whereas I bought this small lot, I can build these 8 affordable housing units right here. That's different, right? And so what's going to distinguish that in the code is what I'm asking.
Yeah, I would lean into your other application criteria. If it's if it's a development scaled at a size that's going to go through a subdivision plat process, there's a trigger there to look at that. If it's going through a site plan review process for multiple family dwelling unit apartment complexes have to go through a site plan review process, there's a trigger there to look at, are we satisfying all of the criteria of Article 5? So I think that's already baked into your application procedures for various land use types, and this would be looked at for those proposals. Again, the proposal here is that land cost is real, and using that same usable land for open space parking, or open space and parking, as a layered approach limits the amount of buildable area for the site. So this is tailored more towards eliminating that requirement for infill developments. If it's not an infill development, they're going through another process that would be catching this.
Okay.
And infill would still have to require or still have to follow minimum setbacks from the front street,
Correct.
which is 35 feet. There's your front yard.
Or
Now you have 35 feet setback plus an additional 20% that you would have to allow for open space. That's, even if you eliminate the 20%, you still have to maintain the setback, which gives you usable open area, lawn space, have your kids out doing somersaults in the front yard.
Yeah.
It's still there.
I was worried about the bigger.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
other areas of the
Right.
code protect
And-
that.
Yeah, and once you reach a certain number of units in a project, you're required to provide a pocket park anyhow. So that, there's other criteria in play there for those larger projects.
Thank you for expanding on that. And we can go to the next slide to see the fun graphic. So the last thing we're looking at amending is the parking requirements for multifamily. So we would be proposing a reduction of 0.5 spaces per 1-bedroom, 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom unit. And so that would be 1 space for a 1-bedroom unit, 1.5 spaces for a 2-bedroom unit, and 2 spaces for a 3-bedroom unit. And if you see that visual off to the right, the size needed for 2 parking spaces, including the parking space and maneuvering aisle, would equate to approximately a 2-bedroom unit. And so if we're looking at a larger multifamily, that could be very impactful for a 20-unit multifamily, 8-unit multifamily even, once those parking spaces count up. And in addition, it would reduce any instances of large swaths of impervious surface parking lots, and allow for some more intentional site layout with your parking spaces and your units. And again, it would be more supportive of that kind of infill development. And lastly, so the Planning Commission tonight may either choose to adopt the land use code amendments and forward a recommendation of approval to the Board of Trustees, adopt the land use amendments related to revisions of certain sections, and forward a recommendation of approval to the Board of Trustees with those noted revisions, or move to continue the public hearing to the next regular meeting, which is April 7th. So thank you all for your time. Aiden, Cody, and I are here if you have any questions.
Thank you, Brittany.
Any clarifying questions on the presentation materials? And we thank you for the questions that came up throughout the presentation. It's really helpful when it's subject matters right there in front of you. So thank you for that. We do still have public comments to allow. So I would encourage at this point, if there's any clarifying questions on the presentation materials, we can answer those. We'll get into deliberations momentarily.
Great.
Okay. Commissioner Carmen, I see you making
I-
notes over there. Did you have a
Yeah,
question?
I'm checking off what I got here.
Okay.
So one question is, other than the multiple dollar signs, what is the cost?
So
Because the
you-
table references $2 to $3 to $4 signs, right? But there's no indication of the cost of making this change.
So, yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm just going back to,
Yep.
this is the implementation table
Yep.
that's in the packet, and we put it here too. So you're referring to the last column for anticipated cost.
Anticipated cost, yeah.
So these dollar signs just represent order of magnitude. There's not a fixed dollar amount. A lot of these things, especially in like the outgoing years, long-term, we haven't even penciled what the true cost would be to some of these. So what we're using them is more of a representative indicator that right now we're tackling these first 4 to 5 strategies. The cost is basically staff time. We've done the in-house research, the in-house drafting. We've prepared the presentation materials. It's relatively low cost because it's using existing staff time. When you get into $2 signs, what we're looking at there is this is going to require some outside guidance, some outside professional services to help with research and preparing some of those materials. $3 signs might be we're contracting with professional services to do research, develop strategies, as well as programs. If we're pursuing grant funding, grant funds have matching fund requirements. So there's real dollars associated with the services being provided. Staffing resources could be a consideration there too. If we're adding new programs to be administered, that might come with additional staffing to administer those programs. So it's intended to be broad and demonstrate order of magnitude as opposed to a defined dollar amount.
Great, thank you. Going back to the communication that we received from Ms. Gator, was any of that included in this report or in this study?
Not in the study. The comments received from Ms. Gator were received after this information's already published in.
Right. But what
about
I'm talking
misunderstood.
about was there was apparently a meeting in 2021 and there was a petition with twice as many people that signed the petition than participated in the survey. Was any of that taken into consideration with the recommendations that you're making?
Okay, so thank you for clarifying the question. The citizen petition that Ms. Gator, provided to the commission was pulled from one of our past packet materials from 2021. the July or August meeting of 2021. So that information was presented during the comp plan considerations 4 or 5 years ago, 2021, 4 years ago. So the information shared in that meeting series was incorporated through the comprehensive plan, making some changes there. And in the land use code, additionally, a lot of the downtown resident feedback was relating to the specific provisions adopted in the land use code that have architectural design intent for new and infill structures, the densities, the land uses. A lot of the original proposal included allowing more business mix in the downtown areas, and that was kind of pulled out of those recommendations based on that resident feedback. The comprehensive plan had originally proposed allowing commercial to expand into McKinley and Harrison Avenues, and we heard that that was not desired, and so that was pulled out, and the land use code was adopted. The zoning map on the wall behind Commissioner Carmen reflects that the downtown core commercial, which is the Cleveland Avenue strip, is limited to that Cleveland core. It doesn't extend beyond into Harrison or McKinley at the residents' request. So we have incorporated the feedback from that effort back in the 2021 comprehensive plan considerations and the
Great.
2022 land use code adoption.
It seems like there could still be some overlap in terms of what we're talking about here with changes, especially to the R4 downtown neighborhoods. And so all that work happened before I was involved on the
Sure.
Commission here. So, I mean, it seems like there is some overlap there. So was that taken into consideration?
I mean, yes, to the extent that the proposed changes that we're incorporating or that we've proposed in this amendment draft to the R4 district are relatively limited. Allowing the multifamily dwellings as a use by right is one of those considerations that's proposed. We've given some specific examples, and there's a number of units in our existing Old Town R4 zoning. The stacked duplex that was identified a minute ago, that one on a small lot, and you'd never notice it outside of normal day-to-day, walking by it. It's at 20 dwelling units per acre net, which would not be allowed today. There's a fourplex on Harrison that's been there for many years that's over 12 dwelling units per acre and would not be allowed today. So these are the examples that we're trying to decriminalize multifamily housing in our community through making this series of changes. The ADUs are already allowed as a use by right in R4, so we have tried to provide some clarity to what's required or not required for those specific design criteria in the R4. Our recommendation was that accessory units probably don't need to be held to the same standard as the principal unit if they're detached, because they're going to be behind the front wall where you don't see them readily. If it's part of if it's an attached ADU, the same principal standards would apply. So we tried to kind of reflect that there was desire and intent around the architectural requirements and scaling that to allow that multifamily product within those areas, but not go overboard. We also recommended that use limitation to 8 dwelling units per structure for the R4. That's going to scale to something that's more representative of the building heights and character. You can still put the architectural controls for farmhouse, Victorian, and craftsman style into an 8-plex style unit, where you wouldn't necessarily be able to at a higher density range or higher net density. So we feel good that the recommendations we're proposing are reflecting the desires of those comments.
Great.
We recognize that everyone's going to feel a little differently
yeah.
around these
Yeah, yeah.
subject matters, but we have purposefully tried to add some protections in there for the R4.
Great, thank
Can I
you.
jump in there really quickly? Just one other example of a decision we made in the recommendation process that did keep in mind previous resident feedback on R4 is in the report compiled by Matrix, the Housing Needs Assessment. One of their suggestions was allowing mixed use, so essentially commercial and residential uses in one structure as a use by right in R4. And we know that we've heard from residents that the residential character is important to them. So we decided as staff to not put forward that recommendation and instead to keep that as a conditional use for, maybe limited areas. So that's another example of we did, consider that feedback and
Great.
consider the
you.
residential character.
And then last question is, you mentioned in your packet, stakeholder engagement between December 24 and February 25. Was that the survey?
So no, what we separated what we envisioned as the stakeholder group. We kind of resident population generally, and stakeholder was more of our housing catalyst, Wellington Housing Authority, affordable housing builders. We talked with the Boys and Girls Club and other agencies that interact with families that have income needs to get their perspective on what are the barriers to allowing their families to reside and be able to thrive in the communities that they want to live in. So that stakeholder engagement was, we talked with our real estate agents from what they see from a buyer-seller standpoint on what the market needs are, and what the lenders look like for underwriting mortgages for these different housing product types. So that stakeholder engagement was really to drill down into the unique aspects of different trades associated with housing, whereas the resident survey was more about what are our residents experiencing and feeling in terms of their housing needs. So those two subsets were distinctly broken out because the questions are very different.
Right. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay. If there's nothing else from the commission, we'll go ahead and open up the actual public hearing portion, which I will do now. If anyone wishes to speak, the podium's open. You'll have 3 minutes time. Come on up if you'd like.
Yep. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine.
I'm gonna go fast because I only got 3 minutes. The town doesn't listen. I feel like the town isn't listening to residents. Let's look at page 2 on the survey. People prefer single-family homes 1.5 times more than apartments. Page 3, yet the need assessment says we need to expand beyond single-family homes, not listening to residents. Page 4, they came here because of the small town aesthetics, affordability of housing, and low crime rate. This shows that residents don't want multifamily homes because it doesn't promote the small town look. Page 5 and 6 are from a sheriff's annual report saying the top 10 locations of crime, apartments are in the top 10. Page 7 is they might say, well, the citizens have said that rising costs means we need more affordability, but I say that's just inflation. If you go to page 8, you'll see that this is posted by a real estate agent, NOCO housing prices. We are among the cheapest in the area, the lowest in the area for housing prices. It's gone up everywhere because inflation. Next page is page 9. The need assessment says that there's a limited number of land in Wellington to develop on. The next page is the residential dwelling unit inventory where there's almost 2,000 lots to develop. An idea that Berthoud is doing is Mission Homes, small tiny homes, 900 to 1,200 square foot. Starter homes, which are more affordable. Just the next one, 12 and 13. This is in 2021. The downtown residents spoke out against high density. We don't want it in our neighborhood. Another thing that you can do is just reduce regulations. And then the citizen petition at the end, the last page is my request. And that's what to get rid of. And that's the P in the multifamily dwelling in R4 and the R4 multifamily dwelling thing. And it's coming across that the town is ignoring what the residents want and is pushing their agenda, which is apartments, multifamily housing, which we don't want in our neighborhood. And I think it's pretty affordable. People moved here because it was affordable. They moved here because of the small town look, low crime. And I think if we add the multifamily housing, we will not have the small town look anymore. Crime might go up. And I don't think we need multifamily housing in order to be affordable. We are one of the most affordable areas in this area. That's it. Thank you so much.
Got it. Thank you, Christine.
John Gator, live in downtown. Just a couple of comments that I have. Number one, as you're looking at parking, I understand you're talking about residential, not on commercial, but that's one of the things that we are constantly hearing about, especially in downtown, is we don't have enough parking. And so be very thoughtful about going through this and what you're doing with parking and what you're changing there. Another thing that I did want to highlight is if you're removing something that's a restriction, talking about the open space, I think Commissioner Chalet, you're asking great questions. Understand what that other rule is, and maybe Mr. Byrd can provide that to you. Understand where that will kick in or where that won't kick in, because we have seen that happen where rules have been changed and there's an unforeseen circumstance, as you shared, where something ends up happening that we weren't intending. And there's been a lot of examples of that even in the last 4 years. So think through things. And if you're not sure on something, please take the time to go through that. And then something else that I'd like to share, and this is mostly for the chair and for the members of the commission, please be thoughtful of your mannerisms. You have commissioners asking some great questions and you're checking your watch, you're holding your face, and it's looking like you're upset by their questions. And that's probably not your intention, but be aware that that's what it might look like to others. I did not appoint all of the people on this commission, but most of the people that were on this commission, I was the trustee that interviewed most of you. And I appreciate the detail, the questions that you're asking. You are not elected by the representatives. You are appointed to this planning commission to ask those questions, to double check things, and to make sure that there is accuracy. So please continue doing that, and please be aware of the things that you're doing when you're leading the commission. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, if there's no other comments, we will go ahead and close the public hearing section. There's no applicant, so we don't have a rebuttal for anything. Let's take 5 minutes, guys. Actually, let's take 7 minutes. Come back at 8 o'clock. Okay, thank you, Mr. Checkett. We'll go ahead and reconvene. After the recess, I guess, Cody, is there anything that you wanted to comment on or clarify after the public hearing portion? And if not, we can move into deliberation through the board.
Yeah, so just as kind of staff's response to what we heard for public hearing comments, we appreciate perspective being shared at these. That's why we have the public hearings. While it's never, staff's intent to ignore resident concerns or comments, we do have to start with something. And so we did put together a set of amendments that we feel is representative of the goal for attaining more housing affordability options in Wellington. And if there's more public comment out there, we do want to continue to hear it. So we'll have opportunities at the Board of Trustees for additional comments as well. And in terms of the materials that were shared during the presentation, one of the things I wanted to point out is on the second page of the handout that was provided, where it points to traditional single-family homes being one of the leading desires of residents to carry forward. Senior living facilities was also high on that list, which speaks to housing affordability at 26%. Traditional single-family homes was at 24%. Duplexes, triplexes, townhomes, condos, apartments, and others considered collectively as 42% of resident feedback seeking other non-traditional forms of housing. So we do feel that that's a pretty representative target, even though it's broken out across multiple dwelling types, 42%.
All classify as multifamily. They
Could
would
be
under the land use
multifamily
code.
or single family attached, could be either of those. But the housing variety, housing diversity is what we've been looking at in terms of staff's approach to housing product types and housing affordability. And so 42% of residents identifying other forms of housing, which corresponds to the dot exercise on the boards in front of you. We do feel that is important to address resident needs and resident feedback.
And just to clarify, it's not residents, it's survey respondents. 104 respondents. So it's 42% of survey respondents.
Correct.
Right,
That's
not residents.
That's correct. Yes. Of the surveys that
Right.
are the responding parties, that is correct. Thank you. I don't have any other additional comments at this time, but I would encourage, I was explaining right before the break that to the question, what happens next? I would encourage the planning commission as you approach your deliberations, probably the red line version is maybe the most appropriate to identify the proposed wording changes in the code. And beginning on page 6 of your packet, staff found it really useful as we were preparing information to kind of group some of the themes by category. And so that's how that table of the summary changes is laid out, where you see 3 columns. The first column is kind of getting to what are we trying to accomplish with this change. The middle column is in a summary what the change consists of, including, you know, this dimension to this dimension or this density to this density. And the last column is the code section reference, which you can then go directly to your red line version to find exactly where that change is proposed. So at this point, Mr. Chairman, staff is happy to answer questions or assist the planning commissioners as you work through your deliberations.
Okay, anyone have a starting point? There's a little.
I have
lot
a
to tackle.
question. Should this be approved, what happens next?
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So as the planning commission is working through your deliberations, at the end of the session, you would be looking to do one of a couple of things. If you supported all of the recommendations as presented, you could adopt or approve a motion to adopt those changes and forward a recommendation on to the Board of Trustees. You can make revisions to these and staff can help you craft the right motion if that's your desire. Or you can table this to a later date if you need more time to think about this or want additional research done by staff. We can bring those things back. But at the end of the session, the Planning Commission's recommendations would be forwarded on to the Board of Trustees, whether that's tonight or another night. The recommendation of the Planning Commission gets passed on to the Board of Trustees, and they would then conduct a public hearing on the same subject matter to then decide whether or not those changes get adopted into the town's code. Did that answer?
It does,
Okay.
thank you. And is there any kind of rezoning that has to happen with all these public hearings?
Good question. So the nature of the considerations in front of the Planning Commission tonight are legislative, meaning they affect broad classes of properties. They are not a property-specific change, so they're not a quasi-judicial proceeding. This is a legislative hearing, and they would apply to broad classes of properties.
So I heard no.
Correct. The answer is there are no rezonings proposed
Thank
as
you.
part of this change.
Thank you.
Commissioner Shelley, you volunteered.
Well, first, I would just like to say thank you for answering my clarifying questions. I think overall, I agree with the recommendations. And while I recognize there was only 104 respondents, I also recognize personal experience of having students who are getting ready to graduate high school who are not planning to go on to college, lacking an opportunity to stay in the community they grew up in because there is not an availability of housing for them outside of their parents' house. That's just the truth. You cannot be an 18, 19-year-old student that wants to stay in Wellington who wants to rent an apartment here because it's not affordable. And there's very few of those. You also can't look at buying anything here if you're a teacher. I have one of those too. So I think part of the single family home response is because that's all we have here, right? So the people that are responding already live in these kinds of homes. Senior housing is a serious issue here. I got a little stuck on the multifamily housing in R4. Trying to visualize 16 dwelling units on an acre. When you really start thinking about that, that would require 2 8-unit buildings on something the size of a football field. I don't feel like that's extreme or likely because that isn't available in R4. considering what is in R4. I don't think we run the risk of anything too extreme, and I'm actually more concerned about the housing that we currently have that's non-conforming, that's always been a concern, that was a huge concern during comprehensive planning and the last land use code update, that these people would literally lose what they currently have if it were burnt down, and these changes fix that. And for that reason, I will support the changes in R4 as well. It provides some opportunity for senior housing, for some better affordable housing. A lot of this already exists in R4, and I don't see anybody coming in, mowing down houses and putting up skyscrapers because they can't. The height restriction remains. So much of it still remains that, and any site plan is going to have to come in front of this body in order to be approved. And we can hold them to the letter of the law, just as I would expect that the planning department and the building department would do the same before they get in front of us. So with that, I feel comfortable with the changes as is. I will support it. So that's where I stand.
Thank you. Well said. Is there anything, I'll try to tighten this up a little bit too, maybe. Is there anything that anybody is a hard no on? Is there anything that we've gone over that is just, for you, it's a no, I'm not going to approve it as is because of this provision that's outlined by staff? Does anybody have anything that's just not going to fly?
Yeah, I'm a hard no. And a lot of it has to do with, I think two things. I think one, I don't think we've done due diligence. We've done a lot of diligence. I just think there's more to do. Let me rephrase that, right? You guys have done a good job with what you've done. I just think there's more to do. And I lost the other reason, so it must not be important. On the matrix study, essentially 0.008% of the population is represented in that. On page 95, they commingle affordability with availability in one of their charts, which are two different things. Affordability is an issue, but and I think it's a function of availability, okay? And I think the other consideration is economics. One of the points that has already been mentioned in public comment that I also highlighted was cost of utilities. And as we all know, water continues to be and will continue to be an issue. So that's another issue. From my perspective, I think there's a lot of interdependencies that have to be coordinated. And I don't think that has been clearly identified because several questions tonight kind of surface some of those interdependencies. The comment about no demand for short-term rentals was interesting, given that this whole thing was based on a demand for affordability in short-term rentals. And even in multifamily, those are often short-term rentals, right? So
Short-term rentals are something that is like a week-long vacation, or what I was referring to.
Airbnb. No, I hear you. And I'm not talking about Airbnb.
But that's what I was referring to when I asked the question.
Totally get it. Totally get it. I'm in a different place. I'm in a totally different place. I mean, it could be 3 months. It could be seasonal. A lot of people will rent and then they'll move on, right? So to me, that was just an interesting contrast. And so, at the end of the day, I think there's more work to be done, and it's too much. It's biting off too much. So to try to approve something this significant that affects so many people, to me, it's too big. I'd be more in favor of addressing, I mean, even the cost. We don't even know what the cost is. We have, emoticons showing what the cost is. And to me, I can't vote yes on something whenever it's a big question mark on what the cost is. That's where I am today. So I just think there's more work that needs to be done on it.
I guess I should have clarified more. It was anything specific with what we're looking at tonight as far as these land use code changes. I understand what you're saying about the the implementation table and all the different costs and everything, but some of that is, we're not addressing it tonight. So it's not even on the table for consideration as far as what something that we're not even going to talk about or hasn't been identified yet. It might cost
Well,
5
kind
years
of
down the
proves my
road.
point. There's more work to
But
be
we're
done.
not looking at that right now at this meeting.
So how
that-
can we vote in favor of something if there's,
But we're not voting on it. We're voting on the specific land use changes that are presented in the packet tonight. I guess,
Yeah,
so the,
Chairman, if I think I see both points being made. I guess one of the things that Chairman Sarters pointed out is that the public hearing advertised is for the code changes that were presented in the packet tonight that don't have a cost implication outside of the town staff expenses that we've already put into it. That those changes in the land use code don't commit the town to doing any of the other implementation steps. Those are projects and programs that we think still have merit to look at to tackle housing affordability down the road. But the consideration for the code changes presently don't require us to do anything further with those other, the larger dollar signs, the undefined dollar amounts. Those would, for those programs and efforts to take place, if additional funding, staff resources, or other resources were needed, town staff would have to go to the Board of Trustees and present, this is what we're asking for. Do you appropriate funds for us to do that? And they would be voting on the cost implications of whether that's a go or no go at that time.
thank you, I appreciate that. But it begs the question, the emphasis that was put on this table and the comments that were made at the beginning of this meeting about this being a multifaceted, multi-layered, multi-step process. And so to vote yes on this sets in motion, right? It clearly sets in motion what comes next. And yet we don't know what comes next because there's still unanswered questions.
If I'm reading this table right, we're literally doing the very first line in the short-term strategies, and that's it. Am I right?
Probably the first couple. in
But
terms of-
everything else on here requires trustee initiative and approval. I mean, this also will require trustee approval, but my point being, updating your processes, well, that's probably more you, but anything that's like amending our standards, building code standards, or amending incentive or creating incentives, none of that has anything to do with us. This is a land use code change that allows these options to be open to the Board of Trustees if they choose to pursue them. If we are not recommending this, then we are closing the door. This simply changes the land use code and everybody will wake up tomorrow and all the buildings will be the same, but there might be a couple opportunities for people and some properties will be protected that weren't protected before. So I understand where you're coming from, but we're not signing on a dotted line to do all of these things. We're literally creating the first opportunity for some of these to be done if it's so desired. And I think that's super important. To think that we should just stay where we are and be stagnant isn't going to help anything.
I'm not suggesting that at all. I'm suggesting more work needs to be done.
So what would you like to see different than what's proposed right now? If you could change it, what land use codes do you not like the changes in and what would you change them to?
I want to see clarification on the interdependencies with the other codes. I don't want to leave that to guesswork. I want to see cost estimates. And it'd be nice to have more input from the community. And I get what Mr. Byrd, what you're saying about that being difficult. But it seems like there ought to be some opportunity to get more input from the community. You don't have to agree with me. I mean, it's clear you don't, but
Well, I'm just
that's,
understanding what cost estimates you're talking about. The land use code changes will literally go in front of the Board of Trustees. Hear me out. They will go in front of the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees will either choose to approve them, only approve some of them, or reject them. And if they're rejected, then we're done with it. If they approve them or approve with different changes, then there's a notice and they go into effect 30 days later, correct? Is that right? 30, whatever it is.
Can you restate the question?
Once if we make a recommendation tonight, it goes in front of the Board of Trustees. The Board of Trustees can choose to accept our recommendations and approve it, or approve it with changes, or just deny it all out. And then 30 days, if they approve it, 30 days later, they go into effect, right? And you have to publish that notice.
Correct.
That's so whatever it costs to publish is the extent of the costs. And that's it, because that's all we're doing is changing the land use code. We're not doing anything else. So I don't know what you're saying when you say cost estimates. If you're talking about the other program pieces, well, that's a different consideration and not what we're considering tonight. So when you say you want to know interdependencies, I'm asking you, genuine question, not being argumentative, what code do you want to know how it's dependent?
It's not about a specific code. If these medium-term and long-term and ongoing strategies weren't important for affordable housing, they wouldn't be included. They're included because they're an important component.
Down the road, though, I mean.
Right.
So I'd like to make a comment. I mean, we've gone through this housing needs assessment, and if it shows you anything, there's a real issue here. I mean, I thought this was pretty well laid out. I do recognize there's only 104 residents, but they are pulling data off of national databases, and this is certainly not their first go-around. I mean, I found this to be a very sobering report, and I can't remember which page it is, but it's on this handout that many people who live here in this town right now, where they try to purchase their home, they wouldn't be able to anymore. So, I mean, and what we do is we make recommendations. This board makes recommendations. We have zero authority to implement anything. That the policy is set and implemented or rejected or modified by the Board of Trustees at another meeting. I mean, all we do is provide a recommendation, you know, and I'm generally very supportive of what I see here. I don't see a lot of issues like getting rid of the minimum housing side. I mean, I think this is an attempt to clean up some things that have been ambiguous. It's an ongoing process. So, I mean, there's nothing here that I see as some serious no-go, like absolutely positively not, you know? But again, ultimately, this will go up to the trustees, and they were encouraging to have this stuff pursued. Whether what gets delivered to them is to their satisfaction, that's a very different subject, it's a different board, and they will do with what we ultimately send to them what they feel is the most informed decision regarding this subject matter. But I do think we have to start somewhere, and because where we're at is unaffordability, and single-family homes aren't doing it. It's just going to continue that process. I mean, it may be different than what we've done before, but I've lived in apartments. I've lived in multi-unit buildings. I didn't buy a house till I was out of college for, gee, I don't know, 30 years? And that was a long time ago. And I'll tell you, the housing prices have not come down. I couldn't afford the house I own back east. It's gone up 4 times. Good thing I bought it a long ago, but so something's got to give here, I think. And again, I think this is to look at this and not recognize there are some serious affordability issues here is, I don't know how you pulled that one off, but this was stunning and sobering. So I think we need to make some first steps. Are we going to get it perfectly right? We may not, and guess what? They have to come back, and if there's an unintended consequence, I think we can sort that out too. But I do think we have to start somewhere, in my opinion.
Thank you, Commissioner Whitehouse. I think the original question that I asked that started this was if there was anything specific that we could give staff direction to make a change in 30 days. Because that's always the point, right? If we're not gonna vote, we're not gonna approve it tonight. If there's anything that somebody needs to see changed, if we're gonna approve it with conditions, that's always the next step for staff is If there's a condition, what do we need to do to bring it back to get as many votes, as many yeses as possible? So if there's something in particular, I'll go on record, I'm not a fan of increasing the maximum density for R4. I was on the Land Use Planning Commission. It was contentious. It was ugly. I don't think we need to be screwing with it, especially when adding an occasional multifamily is not going to impact the existing density it's not going to impact the existing density enough that anyone will, number one, notice, and number two, that it will ever extend beyond what it is right now at 12. We can add we can add a one duplex on each block in the R4 and still stay well within what the maximum density is. So in the short term, medium term, I don't think there's any reason to mess with that, just given the fact of how contentious, I don't know that there's a better word for that. That was probably the single hardest part of the land use code and the comp plan to get through, was anything and everything that had to do with downtown. So I'll go on record, I would like to see that stay at 12. Otherwise, I don't have any issues with everything else. I think, like Tim said, it's a good place to start in a lot of these places. We do need to do something. Let's all keep in mind this entire project, this entire outreach was initiated by the Board of Trustees. They're expecting to see something back. It's our responsibility to give them something.
I mean, I don't know visually, I keep trying to imagine what the difference is between 12 and 16, right? So given what, and you're right, it was super contentious. So to me, giving it a use by right, but keeping the density is a good compromise. And I'm okay with that if everybody else is okay with going down to 12.
I would support that.
Allowing the multifamilies, but keeping the density at 12.
Yeah, now the other question I have is, so, and these densities are per acre, yes?
So if I could take a
If you
moment
could
to
clarify.
explain,
Yes, please.
there's two components to density. There's gross density, which is measured across a broad sector irrespective of property lines. Net density, you can look at it as what's within the four lot lines of an individual lot. So when we're talking about gross density, we did this study back in the comprehensive plan effort a couple of years ago. We looked at all of the areas that were proposed to be zoned R4 with those recommendations from the comp plan. The gross density across all R4 was 5 dwelling units per acre existing at that time. We have not restudied that, but I don't think it's changed dramatically. So 5 dwelling units per acre gross across all of R4. Net density on an individual lot that's proposed for redevelopment or infill development, if it's a 4,000 square foot lot in R4 and they're proposing a stacked duplex, the example we pointed to earlier, that's over 20 dwelling units per acre net, because it's 4 property lines, the area in between, net density on that one property is over 20 dwelling units per acre.
Because you're expanding that out over the entire acre.
Yeah, if you extrapolate it.
Extrapolating, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, that
And
makes
so,
sense.
so net density is measured to the individual property proposal. So I'm getting a little bit into the numbers here, but if you turn that around and say, if we're restricting it to 12 dwelling units per acre, and that's the max, which is the current max, and that's okay if that's where it needs to stay. But for that same 2-unit apartment complex, you would have to have a lot size of, I don't do that kind of math, but off the top of my head, but if you turn it around at the minimum dwelling units per acre count, you would have to have a lot size that's more than, what is it?
I think it's like 8,000 or 9,000 square feet.
8,000 or 9,000 square feet approximately to accomplish the same project type. But then you have this big lot with the land costs associated with it, or it's underutilized. So that's the math that we're looking at here, that for that same type of project that might otherwise be built and fit within the character of the neighborhood and the block pattern density that's existing, net density can be a real deal killer because you're specifically limited it to that property can't exceed a square foot buildable per that lot. Gross density, that same change, a vacant lot to a stacked duplex in that example, net density might be close to 20 dwelling units per acre, but the gross density of the R4 downtown didn't change at all. It's still 5. You would,
think-
if you doubled every single residential lot in Old Town, your gross density would still be 10 dwelling units per acre, which is still less than the minimum that's allowed today.
I feel like that is where everybody's head is at. Yes. We're all looking at this in gross density. To just pop in an occasional duplex or a triplex on any random block is not gonna be a problem. Nobody will notice. But if the net is the deal killer and that's what needs to change, I guess that's a different story.
Right, I guess I didn't realize,
Yeah, good clarification.
like, I literally was thinking gross density, right? So when you say it that way,
So, yeah, and gross density, just to put that in perspective, gross density you look at more frequently when you're doing a new subdivision and you're looking at, here's the, 40-acre parcel of land. What are you proposing to build? We're gonna propose, residential units. And gross density looks at what happens when you take out, that's the total number of units that would be allowed. And then you can start taking out your roads, your open space dedications, your parking requirements, et cetera. Net density is still always going to be confined to the area within your property lines.
so if it's 16 dwelling units net density, that's approximately what size lot would you need for that?
Run it by me again.
So if we agreed to up it to the 16, what size lot are you looking at, like, to build that same thing?
5,500 square feet is what my mental math says. Don't 100% quote me,
But aren't they per acre? So is it the dwelling units DU per acre? Is that net or gross?
Net.
Net.
No, but you're not starting with a full acre, you're starting with a fractional acre.
Okay.
So like,
This is where I think all of us were thinking,
So it
we're all
would
thinking gross.
probably not change the gross at all because they're just, I mean,
Right.
Yeah.
It's negligible over
There's
an
not that
entire
much
acre.
property down
I'd like to make a proposal, which may surprise some of you or irritate others. We chatted briefly during the break, and I feel like this might help. It would help me. But it'd be helpful to see what the current is and what the recommended change is. R1s, R2s, R3s, ADUs, the whole thing, right? So rather than trying to read through paragraphs of red lines, if we could see a table that showed, here's what it is now, this is the recommended change. It'd be a lot easier for me to digest that and maybe all of us to be able to have a sense of what feels good and what doesn't feel good. I know that can't happen tonight.
So staff is perfectly happy to provide additional information and clarity in these circumstances. It's not directly on point with what Commissioner Carmen is alluding to, which I think is a great suggestion. What we did put together is, beginning on page 6 of your packet, is a summary of the proposed code changes. So the way we laid that out was it helped staff to look at, what's affecting the diversity of housing types, which code sections are we proposing to amend, and what are we trying to accomplish, and what are the code amendments. So if I'm looking at page 6, and in that table, we're saying that the desired changes to identify that allowing a variety of housing types, sizes, and mix of ownership and rental units is desirable within the residential zone districts. Our proposed code amendments were to update the district intent statements and the PUD district intent statement, and the sections of code that are reflecting those changes can be found in the red line version at section 15.320 and 15.350. So, and that may not be the best example to Commissioner Carmen's point, but on the next page, page 7, we talk about the densities, and the middle column for proposed code amendments, we talk about specifically the recommended changes are to increase the maximum net density in the following zone districts: R2 from 8 dwelling units, or to 8 dwelling units. I see. You wanted to see what was the existing.
Kern and R2, I thought is 1, and Kern and R3, I thought was 12. Is that correct? I pulled that from other parts of the comp plan or land use code.
Yeah, we didn't recommend changes to R1. R2, the existing net density is 6 dwelling units per acre, and we proposed increasing it to 8. R4 is currently 12 and we propose to increase it to 16. We've heard that that may not have support. R3 and C3, we are existing 12 dwelling units per acre and we had proposed up to 24. So I do see Commissioner Carmen's point that this table that we put together doesn't have what the existing code is. That is identified in the red line comments, but they're not necessarily
Right.
easy to correlate.
And in some of the presentation, some things are going up, some things are going down. And so to be able to see that by R1 altogether, regardless of the goal, R2 altogether, regardless of the goal, right? It'd be easier to kind of get a sense of what are we proposing or what do we want to modify, right?
Yeah, so and beginning in page 13 of the packet is the red lines in the table that's in the code where we identify, you can see the strike through font is the existing requirement and the underlined text is the proposed. So while it's not all on one sheet, all the information that Commissioner Carmen's asking for is in the packet. It's just spread out a little bit. So I'd be happy to help point to connect the dots, so to speak, if that's helpful.
I think it's interesting that R3 is doubling in size and there's no one here to speak out against it. I live in R3.
You do?
I do.
Do I?
It's just R4. It's always R4.
I never know. I don't even know what zone district I live in. What zone district do I live in?
Planning commissioner.
I
Yeah,
can't remember anymore.
Lisa.
This is R3, this color.
Oh, that color's,
I think that's R1.
that's R1.
I thought yellow's R3, isn't it?
Yeah.
Is yellow R3? Oh, so I don't live in,
R2 is the most common.
that's what I live in.
district
Okay.
Classification.
Two's going up, so.
So here's
R3.
my question. By by
R3.
increasing the maximum net density for, now that I understand that better, what that means, when you're talking about R2 and R3 to that point, and you're reducing the lot, that's a huge lot size reduction in R3, I'll just say. Is that also then gonna provide less green space, meaning less water consumption, more affordability from that standpoint after the fact?
You're asking about water demand relative to density.
Yeah,
I'll speak to it.
single family
I'll
attached.
speak to it
or detached.
broadly because I don't want to, this is not something that we studied for this effort specifically. But as a general characterization, when you increase the amount of rooftops, paving and other things, your irrigation demand is going to go down. Your overall indoor demand may go up based on unit counts, but your smaller unit sizes are going
They
to
use less.
typically less water than a large unit. So those are the trends that we would expect to see, although we have not quantified specific numbers for those examples
Right, so,
for this effort
because we reduced the lots, is that Saddleback or whatever that was?
on the east side of the
Yeah.
highway, Saddleback,
That's where we reduced the lot sizes there, right?
correct?
And that's R3.
Correct. That, in that Saddleback request, which is east of I-25 near the south end, it's County Road 60. The proposal there was it was previously R2 with minimum lot widths of 60 feet. And the developer had proposed, we can make this more water efficient by going to narrower lot widths with a narrower product type and put more of that open space into a native vegetation that uses less water. And
Right.
by increasing the number of units, there's less turf grass in the yards, in the side yards that aren't the most usable space for residents. It put more of the emphasis on the backyards for the residents to do what they choose and limiting the amount of irrigable need for the front and side yards. So that was that proposal. The indoor demand per unit for estimation purposes didn't change.
Right,
just
but it was the
number of units that
outdoor,
changed.
because that was also not on potable, or it was
That
on potable water, not
Correct.
non-potable.
correct. That example is on town treated water for irrigation.
Right.
Many of our other subdivisions have non-pot systems.
So my point being, like, with the R3 changing, doubling, is that then also?
But keep in
That's a
mind,
lot.
It is, right? So it's a lot. But keep in mind all the things that have to happen downstream from here. All we're doing is opening the door.
Right.
We're moving restrictions, right? We're
Yep.
moving restrictions to allow it to happen. If a developer comes in and still wants to propose something that doesn't make any sense, we know what those barriers are. I don't need any clarification. I've been doing this for 5 years. I know that they have to go through site plan requirements. I know they have to go through planning and zoning and building requirements. I know the town is going to scrutinize literally everything they do because that's what they do, and they do a good job. But I'm comfortable with all the safeguards that are in place after that. All we're doing is allowing it to happen.
So now are you okay with 16?
I-
Or do you want it to be-
8,500 square feet for a duplex? That's a big lot.
That's my mental math, so don't quote me, but it should be one. Oh, my brain is freezing. So basically, so how would you calculate? You would figure out, right, you would need 1/12 of an acre for one dwelling unit, right? So you would need 2/12 of an acre, so 1/6 of an acre
For a duplex,
for a duplex. An acre is what,
43K.
4,400 square feet?
43.
44,000.
Yeah, so 1/7 is, I mean, 1/6 is 7,500 maybe, 7,200, 7,260, thank
So
you.
you'd
Brittany.
need basically the same lot size as R2 has for a
Yeah.
standard to put a duplex on.
And if you
That's
went,
in
bigger
R4.
than my lot.
And then, yeah, it's bigger than a lot of lots.
if you went to 16, that number would go to about 5,500.
But are you talking a one-story duplex or two-story duplex?
Doesn't matter. It's dwelling
Have to
units.
meet
Right.
setbacks.
It's just, well, it's people living in that structure.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
And I mean, our property is like 8,000 corner lot.
Yeah.
We have 3 buildings on it.
I don't feel like 16 is a huge stretch.
Yeah, not with the gross or the net density being
Yeah. I thought it was
charted out that way. Yep.
So-
No, this is the communication. Great clarification. Great question. Great question, Lisa.
It does say yeah, density.
Uh-huh. See, that's why we talk about this stuff, right?
So, and just maybe if it's useful, when you start to put those components together, density is a definition in your land use code. We did not propose to change that definition, but it alludes to gross density as, it includes both types, right, as applicable. Gross density being calculated by dividing the total number of units by the total acreage, net density calculated by dividing the total number of units by the total acreage minus the publicly dedicated land. So if you're proposing to develop one lot, it's the 4 corners and in. If you owned 2 lots and you were going to redevelop them together, you would look at the 2-lot total as part of that development proposal. The gross density, as I mentioned earlier, comes into play when you're looking at, I've got raw land I bought from the farmer and I'm looking to develop it. It's 40 acres in size. My gross density can't exceed the units for that zone district. And then you take out roads, parks, open space dedication, storm drainage, and other things. Then any redevelopment of that from that point forward, any 4 corners has to look inward and comply with the net density for every single lot. So, and we use that definition as an either or because density by its nature is a dwelling units per acre. The math is always the same. It's how you're looking at it in terms of that proposal. But we do kind of tying that back to the code again. When you look at the, section 315G? The table for the standards where it includes the density calculations, it specifically says maximum net density, and that's the portion that we were proposing to change, nothing related to gross densities.
Right. But that's the more impactful is the net. That's where you'll notice the changes the most. So it
Yeah,
makes sense by, writing the code via net density because that's where you'll see the changes and you'll notice.
And I think it also kind of, to point it out from a staff perspective, when a development proposal is coming to us and they're saying, hey, we want to get together for a pre-application meeting and talk about this proposed project that we're considering, we have to look at this table and we go to your net density, we look at their property size, what are you proposing? Does it fit or does it not? And that's where, kind of running through some scenarios, we took some existing examples and said, if that project were presented today, even though it's existing, fits in the character of the neighborhood, we would have to say no based on this table.
And I think that's what we're all trying to avoid and change is allowing somebody that wants to, you have a 2,000 square foot house in the old town and you want to separate it off, cordon half of it off, create a separate entrance, turn it into a duplex. As of right now, not allowed. Why? Why? It doesn't,
Yeah.
why are we restricting that? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, depending on the lot. I mean, there's some that may work and some that may not.
Right.
Every case has to get looked at on its individual merits, but the
But why have
example-
any barriers to a project like that? That was the point of this whole thing, is to try to pick low-hanging fruit, things that we can easily identify and change via a few tweaks on the land use code. I think that makes sense. Are you sure? I think so. I think so. The net versus gross helped. How are you? Where are you at?
I'm good.
Okay.
Are you good?
You're all good? Nobody's got anything they need to get off their chest one last time? I know where you're at.
I,
Well, and let me just clarify. I'm all for it, right? But it sets in motion some things that are going to require a lot of other things to line up, right? And this commission has been criticized in the past, not necessarily those currently present, right? But historically has been criticized for not thinking things through. Okay? And I would just like to avoid, just like you want to avoid, Mr. Chairman, the ruckus of R4. I'd like to avoid the accusations of we didn't think things through. And so from my perspective, I would be in favor of let's do a little more work and come back so that what we do put forward, we can say, all of us say that we have done our due diligence and we have thought through everything. There's confusion tonight around net and gross, right? So if we're confused about some of this, you can imagine the confusion out in the community. And so we're going to have to be able to respond to that confusion in a way that helps them understand why we made the decision we made. So, but I'm not against affordability or availability.
A valid point. We get criticism. Sometimes it's fair, sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
But
Sure.
again, like Mr. Whitehouse mentioned, that we make recommendations.
Mhm.
So is it easy to come back and blame the planning commission for forwarding something onto the board of trustees? Sure, this is where it started.
Yeah.
In this case, it actually didn't start with us. This was brought down through the board of trustees as something they wanted to see us pursue. So all we're doing is hashing it out and kicking it right back to them. So at the end of the day, I think if the criticism comes, I'm okay with it. I feel comfortable with what we talked about. So that said, if there's anything else or nothing else, somebody does need to move. And let's get a vote in.
can I, Mr. Chair, if I might?
Mr. Byrd,
I
you
wanted
may.
to go back and, to Commissioner Carmen's comment earlier on about the kind of setting the wheels in motion with some of these changes, and there's more to it. I definitely appreciate that, and I've said it numerous times across multiple meetings that housing affordability is, there's no silver bullet. It's not a one and done. It's a ongoing, continued iterative process to truly achieve those results. So I do appreciate that sentiment that you're explaining, and I agree with that. I do also feel that the type of proposed changes that we're making here from a future cost and future board appropriations position, even if they were unable to provide additional funding to accomplish any other goal in this, I do still feel that this is impactful in terms of housing affordability. When staff put this together, we approached this kind of from the recommendations that Matrix had put together for our community, for what they see in the needs, removing some of those barriers that we've literally heard comments from our building community, from our development community, that we would do this project if only we could do this. And we've had specific requests for Saddleback example, that we can make this work if we can make these lots a little narrower. And then it's back in the free market society or the free market's hands to figure out a path to use these tools to make the products more affordable and make it work. Long story short, I would stand behind these recommendations as still meeting housing affordability goals, even if there was no other funding in the future to pursue any other opportunity.
Thank you.
Take a crack at it?
Yep.
Girl.
I move to adopt the land use code amendments related to housing affordability and forward a recommendation of approval to the Board of Trustees.
I'll second.
Roll call, please, Mr. Checkett.
Commissioner Schalay,
Yes.
Commissioner Stringer,
Yes.
Commissioner Whitehouse,
Yes.
Commissioner Carmen,
No.
Chair Sarter,
Yes.
The vote was 4-1, motion carries.
Thank you, Mr. Byrd. That closes that. Any communications from staff otherwise?
The only communication that staff has is we've got the next planning commission meeting is April 7th. We are expecting to bring the housing needs assessment back in a final format with formatting cleaned up, et cetera, for that meeting. It's not a public hearing. You don't have to adopt it. We're presenting it as this is the final draft. The Board of Trustees will probably ask them to accept that final draft so we can put that document on our website as a final version. So we'll probably do that in April. We also have a couple projects that are working on submitting things for public hearings that could be as early as April 7th, and if not, then May 5th would be the next one that would be most likely for a public hearing. So in short, I encourage you to please plan accordingly to be available for those meetings.
Okay. Anything else? Cool. Adjourned.
Thank you all.
Thank you.